Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hugonauts, where we review and discuss with you the best sci-fi novels of all time. This week, we are talking about one of, the best agreed upon, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Brent, what happens in Brave New World?
Okay, here we go. All right, Brave New World, published in 1932, oldie, but a goodie. 288 pages, 8 hours an audiobook, nice and short. It is largely set in a futuristic, unified world state. And it tells the story of a very different kind of dystopia. The population is not tightly controlled in the traditional sense. They're free to do whatever they choose and live phenomenally happy lives by their own assertion. The people living in the world state say they love it. They wouldn't trade it for anything. However, people are born in test tubes, modified in those test tubes to fulfill a role in a caste system, to love their work, and to love the phenomenally hedonistically lifestyle that the world state is set up to achieve for them. Two men, though, are not perfectly happy: Bernard Marx and Helmholtz Watson. Bernard arranges a trip to one of the reservations to try to see a different way of living and meet someone born outside the system, the savage, who begins to question the social order and chafe against the world controllers who run society. And that's our setup. That's what we got to get into here. What's going on with this world state?
It sure is the setup. First, we'll just some brief housekeeping. Make sure you like, subscribe, download, follow, however you listen to the Hugonauts to not miss the next episode, which will be a slight departure, but fun still. A ranking of the Nebula nominees for this year.
Yeah. That'll be
where
really
we
fun.
think they should land, who we think might win. And come and join the Discord if you haven't yet, and chat about your thoughts with other listeners and us.
Yeah, links in the video description or podcast notes, however you're watching or listening to this. So come hang out. It's like 50 of us now chatting about books. It's great.
It is. All right, Brent, so what is your rating of Brave New World?
I love Brave New World, particularly the end. I'm going to give it a 5 stars. It's one of the most thought-provoking books I've ever read. It raises all kinds of super deeply interesting philosophical questions about what makes us happy, what makes life worth living. It also has a bunch of really good social critique in it. The second half just totally fucking slaps. It's great. And it's hilarious, mostly intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. But anyway, very funny pretty frequently.
I give it a 4. I think I agree with everything you said. It's probably the archetypal dystopia, or one of the very top classic dystopias for a reason. I knock it down a point because Huxley's, the time he's writing in, and his own prejudices, sexism, racism show through a bit, even though he's trying to point out the problems with sexism and racism. And so that hypocrisy bothers me a little, but it's more of a punch through than a kind of all-encompassing appearance. We'll talk about that though when we get into it. I love how the book opens, to move on to some analysis. Just a really fun, usually it's the scene with the director showing some students the factory that the clone crushes are created in. And it's super, it reminds me of Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory, but for science fiction and cloning. It's usually expository pieces like this are so awful and hard to wade through.
Especially at the beginning. We literally have no characters, and it's just let's go on a factory tour where they make the test tube babies. But yeah, I'm totally with you. Somehow it was great. As it was first starting, I was like, no. Did I forget? Is this bad? And then as it went on, I was like, oh no, I'm actually totally into this factory tour. Awesome.
Yeah, weirdly, I think about Brave New World, it's the best parts of the book are the parts that aren't character driven. It's the beginning and the end. But yeah, it starts off great like that. And there's also a lot of intercut stuff you want to talk about.
Yeah. Right after,
pretty cool, the writing style.
Yeah, right after the factory tour, we get this thing where it's this section where it's just 1 or 2 paragraphs per viewpoint in 3 different viewpoints, all intercut smashed together. And you'd think it would be really confusing, but it actually totally works, introduces the character, starts to get us into feeling what this world is like in a really good way. I just thought it was really talented writing, basically. There's some spots in this book that like, anyway, I really liked it a lot.
Yeah, it's very cinematic. It has the like prototype Mario Vargas Llosa kind of style, like cinematic literary work. The characters are all named for who they are. And they're named after like famous
All
historical
named for who they
figures.
are. Heard it here, folks. Here first, folks.
Yeah, those are two separate thoughts that I jammed together that almost made sense together. It
They
happens a
do
lot
have
for me.
great names, though. No, I think you're totally right.
Bernard Marx is our main character. And he is kind of a grouch, right? He's something happened in his clone tube, and he's smaller than the other alphas, the top caste. So he's as smart as they are, but he's a lot smaller physically, and so he's not as attractive to women, and he has some other issues. He has a lot of
Kings, not hot since
insecurities.
1932.
Yeah, unfortunately for us short kings, I feel like he's a little bit of possibly a stand-in for Aldous Huxley. Like he's kind of grouchy about his station in life. He's got the like emo artist aura, and he's bothered by where he is, even though he's one of the more intelligent people. And then his counterpart is
Helmholtz Watson. Yeah, and the point you're making about Bernard being a stand-in for Aldous, I just wanted to, like, I hadn't thought of that as we were reading, but I think you might be right, and I really like it because like he's not putting Bernard in a great light. Bernard kind of sucks as the book goes on, but I think you might be right, and it's like makes me think Aldous wasn't like too full of himself, despite being a very smart guy. I think I would have liked to hang out with Aldous. He's a cool dude. Anyway, so maybe he's more like Helmholtz, totally. Who's a chiller. Anyway, so Helmholtz Watson, his friend. Helmholtz is also sort of like uncomfortable with the society. His job is writing propaganda, basically. He like writes films, but all their films like really suck, and Helmholtz is really frustrated about them. And so he's very critical of society, but not because he doesn't feel like he is not at the pinnacle of it. He does feel like he's at the pinnacle of it, and he still just does not really like it. So he's sort of they hang out and like gripe together. And yeah, then we've got Mustafa Mond, another interesting character named after the world.
Yes, right, just the world.
Yeah, he's the world. I think there's actually several of them. So he's one of the council, but he's the only one we meet. He is one of the few world controllers, the people who are running this. I guess you'd call it a dictatorship. No one wants to vote, but they also definitely cannot. So I guess we'll call it a dictatorship. Anyway, we'll talk a lot more about this state later. But yeah, he's an interesting guy. Really interesting guy, actually. He's like one of the... he's such a good villain. He's not a good dude. I don't like him, but also I would like to hang out with him and argue. He's so smart and cool. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, and he's kind of not psyched with his position either, even though he's the top guy. And then finally, I mean, for the beginning of the book, what's important, pre-spoilers, we have Lenina, who's the kind of female foil / sexual object for Marx and Helmholtz, which is maybe one of those things I was talking about earlier that pokes through, where Huxley's trying to point out that sexism, classism, racism are bad, but also she's not really she's not fighting against it or disproving that women are equal.
Yeah, she just likes having sex with one guy more than you're allowed to. That's her rebellion.
She's kind of a yeah, she's a sexist character, even though he's trying to point that out. So
yeah, we'll talk a lot more about
the
cringe factor later. This is a really interesting one. That part of this book is really interesting. But anyway, we'll come back to that.
To break down, yeah. Totally. The whole novel's really fascinating to talk about. It's got so many ideas in it that it's hard to really stick to the train tracks here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, another interesting thing to get into here is just a little segue into, there's a bunch of things that they tell children and lots of other people to control them. It's part of the way they like raise these citizens who like this lifestyle. and they repeat all this stuff to them while they're asleep, like thousands and thousands and thousands of times while they're growing up. But some of the things they repeat to each other are like not objectionable. That's the really interesting thing about this book. There's things about this society that it's like, ooh, is that so bad? Am I a bad person for thinking like that part of this is actually great? But anyway, one of them that really...
like escalator squash.
Yeah, escalator squash sounds fun.
Sounds really fun.
The one that I really jumped out at me that I loved was they have this saying where when somebody wants to like shirk off or whatever, they all say, oh, but we all work for everyone else. I mean, I actually think that really captures the modern economy in a really good way. Like, it all feels like we're kind of doing bullshit, but we're all doing just this like one little thing that helps a bunch of other people like make this thing work. And like, that is what the modern economy is. And that's what money is. There's also corruption, and money doesn't always mean that. But like in a good world, that's what money means, is like you're doing things other people need. So they give you resources that lets you get the things that they produce. Anyway, it really like sums up in such a little concrete thing. Like, everybody works for everybody else. It's like, oh yeah, that we do. I like that one.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then to your point about the sometimes neutral morality here, I guess that's why it makes the world seem so believable, is that there are parts of it that you can say, oh, that is maybe that does sound maybe appealing, even though this other stuff is just awful that supports it.
Yeah.
But then there's also some things that just are in speculative fiction, a book is good when it's really capturing humanity and society as a whole, no matter what time period it takes place in. And there's a lot of comparisons we can make to the modern world that feel really prescient. Like you had one about the jobs that they do.
Yeah. Okay, so they're intentionally messing with some of the embryos to make them smaller, less smart. And then they do some like really barbaric stuff after they're born. Like, for instance, the deltas, they like, when they're children, they like give them books to read. And then as soon as they touch the books, they electric shock them. So they like won't want to read. So they won't learn anything. Obviously, that's very terrible. And in general, it's one of the things that there's like an underlying idea inside this that I think actually a lot of people maybe do subscribe to, this idea that you need like lower class people to do lower class work. And, I just like see it in the world. Like, I don't know. There's like a lot of very rich people in our world who like want to defund public schools because they send their kids to private school. And I think like somewhere underneath that is they're like, well, who cares? We need like dumb people to do whatever job that I think is beneath me.
And they don't need education for that. Why should we? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I just want to say like that really rubs me the wrong way. But I think that's like part of what like a lot of the way he presents stuff, it kind of like it like tugs at strings that are inside us to various degrees. And I think this is a really good example of it, where I think, just at first, obviously, torturing the children is not good. But I think at a very surface level, a lot of people might be like, oh yeah, of course you need some people to do like the bad jobs and sweep up. It's like, well, maybe if everyone was smart, we'd figure out a way that like nobody had to sweep up and we could make some robots or whatever. But anyway,
right. And that's kind of the conceit here, is like, if you take that thinking to its logical conclusion, you might end up with a society like this, where you're making people to do these jobs. You're like, you're cutting every corner. You're not just removing public education. You're actively breeding people who are who have an aversion to it, and a lot of the rest. There's so much else in here that feels not so different than modern politics, like breeding the deltas to feel satisfied doing their delta jobs, and feel a sense of superiority for working harder than the people above them, which is kind of that. I feel like a mentality used by politicians to galvanize people to vote against their own interests, especially on the people who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder. There's also, as we talk about programming morality, I think that the book also does an interesting job of analyzing how morality is kind of a collective societal fiction, right? And it can shift through time. And you know, in this book, the examples used is in the world of Brave New World, promiscuity is a morally high thing to do. There's a lot of attention to that at the beginning. Like if you're not sleeping with a bunch
Yeah,
of
if you're like sleeping with the
different
same
people,
person a lot, like you're weird.
yeah, and you're kind of ostracized for monogamy or monomagic tendencies. I don't know how to nominalize that, but and then consumption is moral. Like you should always be buying stuff, using it, throwing it out. Don't fix anything. And reusing or being resourceful is blasphemous.
Oh yeah, there's a really good mnemonic about. There's one of those children's things about that one. What is it about mending? It's like mending. Mending is it rhymes. It's something like ending is end mending or something like that.
That fixing is mixing. I don't remember what it is, but there's a great.
Yeah. Anyway, you must buy new clothes. If something is torn, just throw it away. Buy something new. Aldous Huxley would definitely be a big like right to repair guy and would fucking hate Fashion Nova. He is out on it. Anyway.
He's not. There's also they also, another thing that I really loved that was interesting to me is like the love of nature is abolished because it's not consumerist, because it's free. Like loving nature and enjoying nature is free. No one can make money on it. So they abolished it, but then they realized there were all these people who were actually paying for transportation out of the cities for nature. So they needed them to keep paying for transportation. So they just made the nature into like resorts and sporting, you know, event sites.
Yeah. You can't play escalator squash in the city. That's ridiculous. You have to go out to the country where the courts are. Same thing with like the good Riemann tennis courts are out in the, I don't know, the fields somewhere.
Which isn't so different from how we do things now, right? Like resorts and golf out in the boonies. So it feels just the logic of it feels fair, and it feels like a critique on the modern world that's accurate. It's all Huxley just has so many good like juxtapositions in the novel that feel that make it feel real and make you. They're so simple too. You're like, oh, we do that. It's like something I might not have thought about otherwise.
Yeah.
But he is kind of a grouch, I think.
I think that he's a really smart guy. I think he's kind of like an emo artist type, super, super intellectual. And I think he views like this like life of hedonism that everyone's living as like an evil in and of itself. And I think that's an interesting thing we should talk about probably later. We're going to do a post-spoilers section to talk about some of the big philosophical stuff at the end of the book, but it's not spoilers in the traditional sense. Like if you haven't read this book in a long time or whatever, you can totally listen to this and still reread the book and not have anything spoiled for you. We're still going to do it in an after section, but anyway, so we'll come back to this idea more.
Well, because the book, there's not that much plot. It's mostly like the value here is in the philosophical conversations. So the plot that is spoiled is like, So up to you, but it's probably fine.
Anyway, so we're going to come back. We're going to come back to that emo artist stuff. We get a lot more good exploration of that later on. He also won a lot of prizes.
Huxley.
People agree. He's a very smart guy. Yes, Huxley did. He really is doing something here that's like really the core of good speculative fiction. He's taking philosophy and parts of our world and then like expanding them out in this fictional place to like help us look at them with fresh eyes. It's just really, really well done. And I think he is part of what helped, he's writing this before almost everyone else who wrote anything we call science fiction, modern science fiction. I think he's like definitely this book in particular is one of those progenitors of using sci-fi as a way to explore social issues and cultural issues.
Yeah. Tagging cool philosophy into an interesting story. And so you get to read something enjoyable while learning a bunch of new things and expanding your mind to think about new things instead of just reading philosophy, which can be quite dull. So yes, Huxley, good at that.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's talk about the cringiness we alluded to earlier for a little bit, because there are some parts of this book that just don't feel great reading in 2023.
Yeah. So here's what I would, the way I think I would put this is like, this isn't like a cringe warning. It's more of like it's like a trigger warning, because a bunch of the stuff that's brought up in this book, like he is trying to be deeply critical of racism and sexism by having this like hyper caste system society. Like the deltas and the epsilons, the low class people, are all described as like, they're all black basically. And I think he's pointing out that like in our society, we don't have a formal caste system, but like we very much have unequal race relations, especially in 1932 when he was writing this. So I think he's both trying to be critical of racism and classism and sexism, but at the same time, he's using language. So I think he's way ahead of his time in 1932, but a bunch of the language that he uses is like not acceptable anymore. It's like, you know, the language he's using, he was ahead of his time for 1932, but like now we have passed him by and what's acceptable. So much of the language that's used, I think, is not right. I think I agree. There's just some times, there's a couple examples that we could talk about in particular, but there's just some times that he's doing stuff that you're like, ooh, Aldous, I want to be on your side, but why did you do that? Why are you writing these words?
Right.
So anyway.
He was ahead of his time, but behind ours. Not a great segue to our next section, which is all about, it's a pretty funny book.
It is. Mostly, I think, intentionally. There's a couple of things that are unintentionally funny, but like, let's just get into them. They're so ridiculous. Okay, so
Yeah,
one
you had some favorites.
that they're always, I had a bunch of favorites. Okay, so one they're doing all through the book is, instead of saying like our father or like, oh geez, or whatever, they always say our Ford. They love Henry Ford because he invented like whatever, factory workers. And I think Aldous Huxley probably was not a fan of Ford and modern consumerism. But anyway, so yeah, it's just really funny when they're always like, oh, our father, and everything is AF instead of, you know, AD and BC. It's after Ford and before Ford. And it's just like kooky. And
yeah, and the idea that the Bible that the head guy pulls out is published in Detroit. That's just a funny, it's a funny detail.
Yep.
What about saxophones?
I loved that one. So saxophones are a thing. But also, like, God, he's prescient at the same time. There's this scene where a couple of the characters go to a concert where they're listening to a bunch of saxophones and synthetic music while an artificial lights show plays, and they all take drugs. And it's like, okay, well, that's ridiculous. I'm going to listen to saxophones. But also, Aldous Huxley invented raves, and we do that.
Yeah, right. And then there's another one, which is Mustafa Mond telling one of the characters about they can't read Shakespeare because no one in the world could understand it, and people are only attracted to new things, and that they need to have new things to keep consuming. And I thought that was the reverse of prescient, which is funny that we would need new things to keep consuming when all that a lot of our art now is just old shit remade, especially movies and in Hollywood. It's like, actually, what you should have done is only Shakespeare forever in newer versions with a new cast, because that's what we're doing now. That's how we're doing consumerism.
Yeah, for sure. And Transformers. I wish we had rehashed Shakespeare a little more and Transformers a little less. But anyway,
right.
Okay, another one that I loved is this is I have to try to say it with a straight face here. There's a scene where they have this like joining ceremony. It's like 12 people where they all like take ecstasy. They call it soma, but like basically everybody takes ecstasy all the time. Anyway, and they all are like chanting, and there's this music, and then they have a big, sorry, I keep swearing in this episode because it's so funny. They have this big orgy, and they all start chanting orgy, porgy, Ford, and fun, like over and over again. This guy wrote the words orgy, porgy, and he's like, yeah, that's what they're going to do in the future when they have orgies. They'll like declare them orgy, porgy time.
Orgy, porgy, orgy, porgy. Which I wanna sing it because I want to have it on the record. The audiobook version specifically reads, and in 6/8 time they sang orgy, porgy, and then the reader sings it in 4/4 after he's just read that's in 6/8, which is a detail.
Well, the poor reader's probably funny. Like me. I don't even know what that is. Wait, so hold on. What you just did? That's in 6/8 time.
1, 2, 3. What? Yeah. Orgy, porgy. That's just my interpretation, but orgy, porgy, orgy, porgy, I think is how he did it in the book, where it's like a little more, it's on that four grid. But
Interesting.
it's just funny. And then there's a ton of other little details, like the reporter. There's a reporter who has an aluminum hat with all these like goofy gadgets on it. And you just see where a lot of especially earlier or 80s, 70s, 80s science fiction films got their goofiness from, like Brazil, which we watched together a few weeks ago. I'm trying to think about Clockwork Orange even has some goofiness like that, just like the visual design.
Weird milk bar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You see the slapstick in the visual design of the world.
Yeah. What is nice, he's got this intellectual novel that's like in many ways very serious, but then like he's also down to have like the way the police subjugate people in the future is they have water pistols that they like shoot you with to make you go to sleep, but he doesn't like call them something else. He just calls them water pistols, which is really funny.
It is.
And the last one I'll throw out there that I really loved, he calls hot women pneumatic. They're just constantly being like, oh, she's so pneumatic. And it's like, oh, okay, that's
the pneumatic tube was invented.
Pretty funny.
The pneumatic tube was invented, and he was all of a sudden like, I mean,
he's like,
those
ooh,
are pretty
the future,
cool.
pneumatic.
It kind of works for me, though, honestly. Like, I like pneumatics works as a phrase for sexy. Okay, before we take up too much time, because we have a lot to talk about post-spoilers, let's do some similar book recommendations for this. They're going to be very obvious, but we're going to say them anyway. Brent, what's your first one?
We got a couple that'll be surprising, but not this one I'm about to say. 1984. It's, the other dystopia that was written around this time that stayed with us for a good reason. It's so good. I can't wait to talk about it. We're going to do it sometime here soon in the near future. So won't say too much more about 1984, but it's like, it's just the dystopia with none of the nice hedonism for the populace part. Anyway, so yeah, that's one that's definitely fits.
Yes. Another one is The Machine Stops, which is actually more of a novella or short, suppose, by E.M. Forster. We actually did an audiobook recording, full cast of that, if you want to check it out. It's free, and we're still making no money on it, so it's not really a pitch, just like, if you want to listen, because it's a great short story. Yeah, exactly. And it's the machine version of this world, the mechanized version instead of the caste version. It has a lot of similarities.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, actually written just before this. It was probably
23 years.
Influence. It's probably an influence for, I would be surprised if Aldous Huxley hadn't read that.
Oh, yeah.
They're both British dudes.
Totally.
Anyway. Okay. And one last one, I'll do Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, which is similarly dystopian, but with a lot of the same overtones. Like, they don't punish people in Clockwork Orange. They just brainwash you. Is that better? You decide. Anyway. So yeah. Really, really good book. And also the movie, both tremendous, tremendous pieces of art. So if you have not seen it, you should see it. If you haven't read it, you should read it. But both are worth doing.
And all the recommendations are really an argument for why Brave New World is such a good dystopia, because as we kind of, the things about our modern world that feel dystopic or kind of, they're all based on the Brave New World paradigm, which is instead of controlling people and making them miserable all the time, but scared, you just make them happy all the time, or like, comatose, and then they'll do what you want.
Yep, for sure.
So it's a good argument for how good Brave New World is. All right. So post spoilers, like we said, it's not going to be too spoily. If you want to stick around, it's still going to be fun to read the book afterwards. But they will start in 3, 2, 1, Brent.
Here we go. Okay, so we go to the reservation, and there's a civilized woman, quote unquote, there, who was abandoned because she was pregnant, which is like super not acceptable in society. There's some interesting drama there that we don't need to get into, but anyway, so she's been living with these Native Americans. It's in America. It's in the Southwest somewhere. P.S. Also, they dammed the Grand Canyon. That's how we know these are really the bad guys. Unbelievable move. Okay.
Don't plug up the Grand Canyon, buddy.
So she has a son, and she taught her son about the civilized world. She told him about it. And she taught him how to read, but he was never really accepted by the Native Americans because he's this white kid and his mom is so weird and has all this other stuff she does. But she gave him, they found like one book with a bunch of Shakespeare plays in it. So he's educated basically just by reading Shakespeare over and over and over again. And the Bernard Marx goes on this tour, finds him, and is like, wow, people are going to think this is a sensation. I'm finally going to be cool and like get laid if I bring this guy back to civilization. So he does. And the savage, as they take to calling him, does not like the Brave New World. And the sort of highlight of the book that for me turned into a 5. Before that, I was like, how good is this? I'm not sure I remember. And then there's like, I don't know, it's like 15 or 20% of the book is just a conversation basically between the savage and Mustafa Mond that is so good and exciting and interesting. That's really what we're going to talk about here.
It's the best scene.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then afterwards, there's a cool BDSM orgy porgy to finish it off. And the savage commits suicide out of shame because he had such a good time at the orgy porgy. That's it. Let's talk about the philosophy.
Maybe we should start with the savage committing suicide at the orgy porgy. Do you want to hop to that real quick?
Yeah. So I actually liked the ending because to me, the savage basically, the position he takes is that everything about the Brave New World is morally bankrupt because like enjoying things, any kind of hedonism of any kind, just like doing things that make you like feel happy must be bad. The only things that are worth of value are like truth and like struggle and like denying yourself pleasures. And I think the reason I think that's interesting is that it feels like Aldous Huxley is using the savage as a way to say, hey, I'm not just like an emo artist with a stick up my butt who thinks everyone needs to suffer. Like I do think it's actually okay to enjoy yourself. And so he uses the savage as a way to show like the savage starts whipping himself because he catches himself like singing while he works. And he's like, oh, well, I was enjoying it. So that means it's wrong. I have to whip myself. Anyway, then some other people see him whipping himself and they come for the spectacle and then they somehow convince him to take some drugs and they all whip each other and chant orgy porgy. And then when he wakes up in the morning, he kills himself because he's upset. So anyway, the reason I liked it is because I think it was Aldous Huxley's way of showing us like the moral gray zone in Brave New World, right? It's a way to say like, is hedonism evil? Well, clearly the opposite of hedonism is not good. So like, how do we find the middle ground? But I know you did not like the ending so much.
I felt like it just sort of ended. It's just kind of ended. But I think your point is good. I guess the reason that I didn't feel that way, now that you've brought it up, I'm like, oh, that is interesting, and I can see how he would be meaning to do that. Why it didn't hit me that way when I was reading it is because he's so against, and the reason I was calling him a grouch the whole episode is because when I was reading it, you don't feel, other than the caste system supporting the rest of the people, the alphas and betas, he's presenting this idea that if people are happy and enjoying themselves and living physically fulfilling, as you say, hedonistic lives, he's presenting that as bad. And I don't necessarily agree with that. Like, it's almost a society that some people are interested in for the future, as long as there's, it's basically a UBI society, but it would be kind of morally doable in a good way if instead of, the caste system, we had the work done by machines or robots or automated systems. And everyone had UBI and, could enjoy themselves. And so I felt like through the rest of the novel, I was getting this vibe that he was like, well, people who play sports and have sex are like, that's bad. That's not our purpose. We shouldn't be focusing on that.
And be upset.
Why the hell not? Sports and sex are fun. And so that's why I thought he was a grouch. And that's why maybe I didn't read the ending as well. I wasn't giving him enough credit on the back end for being balanced about his critiques.
Well, or just because I love this book, I'm choosing to have like a very generous interpretation of the weird ending. Like that's also...
It's better than mine. I'm sure, one of the most famous books of all time doesn't just kind of end. I don't think that's a
No,
fair
it ends
analysis.
with a sweet BDSM orgy. Okay.
Orgy porgy. Yeah, and so the discussion that Mustafa Mond has with well, his name is the Savage, unfortunately, is about the core of it is that the new society's sovereign good, quote, which I love that phrase, I'm going to be taking that one with me, is happiness instead of the sovereign goods being truth and beauty. And that conversation's so fascinating because first of all, it talks about like how humans' morals shift. In fact, I think that happiness is probably closer to a sovereign good today versus truth and beauty, more so than in 1932. That's just completely anecdotal. But I think a lot of people are saying, what's so wrong with just being happy and being good, as long as we're not trotting on other people to do it in today's world. So it's crept up in the estimation of humanity.
Yeah, I think that's right. The thing though the thing that I feel like is so evil and insidious about Brave New World is that I have no judgment of someone, like if someone just chose to live a life the way like the people in Brave New World do, where they like, whatever, took ecstasy and went to a lot of concerts and like played a lot of squash. I don't have judgment for that. If that's how you choose to live your life and that makes you satisfied and happy, I think that's fine. But what they do in Brave New World is they take away,
they remove the choice,
take away the choice. And that's the part that I think is like deeply sadistic and horrifying. It's like, well, stability is the most important thing, and so we're going to like precondition you to like these things which are enjoyable, but then you get no choice in the matter. And if like Helmholtz Watson, you want to like make stories that are more interesting, like you have to get banished to the islands because we can't have you upsetting things. Like that to me is the part that's like so just like where it's like, oh God, like might this like I don't know, it feels. And that's why this is so scary, right? Because it feels like it's the kind of totalitarian society that like modern dictators are trying to create. Like the people who are in charge of some countries in the world. Are we trying to keep whatever? We never talked about whether we're going to name and shame dictators. But in any case, there are some societies in our world today where they
dox them,
think that it's that it's okay. The way they like view reinforcing their own power is they say like, well, as long as I keep making the society like richer so that they can buy more stuff, that means it's fine that I don't give people choices about the way they live their life or who governs them. And I reject that. F no. Like that is deeply dehumanizing, but that's what they do in Brave New World. Like they're trying to make Brave New World basically with like some crazy 1984 surveillance that we'll talk about in that book.
Right. And that is, I think, the fundamental piece of it that makes Brave New World disturbing and morally corrupt, or the world of Brave New World, is the removal of choice in the matter. Because everything else, not everything else, but like for the alphas and the betas, the idea that you're saying that enjoying yourself physically is bad is a little silly. However, it requires the labor and upkeep of many more of the planet's population. And I guess, now that I'm saying that, it's not so different than the modern world, which and human history, which Huxley is pointing out, right? That the people who can enjoy themselves at that level are only able to do that out of the support of most of the rest of the world's population suffering.
Yeah, I think like the whole caste system thing, I think is like a critique of our society as it existed in 1932 and frankly in many ways today, just like the hierarchy and how much better life is for whatever upper class rich people than it is for lower class people. I think that's what he's using to critique that. And then the other piece is this like really interesting argument about like, is a life just lived for hedonism worth living? Is that enjoyable? I think Aldous Huxley would say no, but I think I agree with you. I think most people would say yes. And I think if we lived in a society that was rich enough where everyone could live like the way the alphas and betas do in this book, it does feel to me like that is how most people would choose to live their lives. And I don't think that's wrong, but I do think Aldous Huxley would think that's wrong.
Yeah, which is, I guess, the tension you sense there. But again,
Yeah.
as long as people can choose, you know, the more the merrier at the orgy porgy. As long as it's consensual. We could go on pretty much forever about this book. But for the sake of brevity, if you have thoughts about it, please visit us on the Discord.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is such a fun one to talk about. Would love to hear what you all think about orgies and pneumatic ladies. So anyway, we'll see you there. Hope you all love it too, and keep reading, everybody.